JoJo's Bizarre Adventure made a Breaking Bad reference as far back as 2015 with the Aphex brothers, who seem to be based on the Salamanca twins. Their stands are named after a tense and eerie song, like what played during the Hank fight. They quietly show up and start a brutal attack in public that plays out like the Hank fight, and thematically, it makes sense if they're based on the Salamanca twins because of what each of the rock humans is inspired by. So if JoJo's has referenced Breaking Bad as far back as 2015, why are there only way more references to it now, in the Jojolands? The difference between Jojolion and the Jojolands is that while a single Breaking Bad reference worked for Jojolion, because plot-wise, Damo's group were selling an underground substance, like Eladio's organization, the core argument of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul as stories is connected to the main idea of Part 9, which is how people can betray their relationships and become predatory to the rest of the world when things go south for them. Jojolion was more about growing past what you already have, and the Loca trade was a way to show how people that are more well-off than small communities can infiltrate them and offer them services that ultimately have them go in circles to slowly siphon their power. Because in the new continuity, the formula for JoJo stories has changed. Instead of the Joestars being superhuman role models that fight embodiments of wrongdoing, each of the new JoJos is someone who grows over time to show how a regular person can become one of the role models from the original timeline. So their stories are about avoiding the understandable ways ordinary people can become versions of the original villains. And to make it even harder for them, they're given physical or psychological disadvantages that make it tougher to avoid those pitfalls. So if a new continuity JoJo can work past some kind of problem that makes ordinary people into versions of the original villains, despite having a disadvantage that makes it even harder for them than the average person, then their story can be a more achievable lesson for the audience on how they can improve themselves to become better than they already are. Sandman, Miss Robinson, Gyro, Hot Pants, and Diego all struggled to stand on their own and choose their own paths in life, despite having more autonomy than Johnny, because only Johnny had the persistence to never give up that would allow him to grow stronger and find a way to walk again, because he would never stop fighting tooth and nail for what he wanted, which was a bottomless drive strong enough to pull in the corpse part. And now, in Part 9, Charming Man Haka, Haka's grandfather, and the Corruption Squad are all examples of people that went their own ways and closed off from others to steal and attack other people they could have been mutually benefiting from working with when things got tough for them. And we have multiple characters that reference King Crimson songs, because the point of King Crimson was that he couldn't stand to be on equal footing with others. So their backstories and character struggles are probably tied to ways it's difficult for them to have mutual relationships. But it's also something they have in common that might mean they're destined to eventually work well together. The actual main villains of new continuity JoJo parts are people who have figured out bad ways to work past these hurdles. When the universe throws an overwhelming number of complications at you from all directions that make it hard to stand on your own and follow your own path in life, it might seem easier to just start sacrificing everything and cutting whatever corners you can. But JoJo would argue that this is bad, because sacrificing anything at the first opportunity, instead of risking everything to go home with all of it, means you're really just letting the universe chip away at what you have and moving the goalpost. So if you leverage any power you do get from cutting corners and making sacrifices to then take more power from others, all you're doing is dragging the world down with you instead of solving any of its problems. So you're in a loop of using up what you have possession of at the expense of everyone at your mercy, to then pen off and steal power over more people's things, which you'll then also use up while you slowly lose sight of why you were taking all these shortcuts in the first place. Funny Valentine's stand comes from the idea that his mindset gives him unmatched power over people, and will needlessly sacrifice the well-being of anyone in his grasp because he'll use any advantage or underhanded method he has to cut corners. He sees any advantages as opportunities that give him the freedom to use any underhanded methods or cut corners, so he can deal with things as easily as possible, which bleeds into how he lies and appropriates the identity of the corpse to convince Lucy to move where he wants her to, and how he made countless sacrifices across entire worlds and wasted his nation's time and resources just to create a power that would do nothing but steal the fortune that already exists from others, instead of make more positive things to add to the world. In the Jojolands, the main villain would be someone who has a solution to how opening up to others makes you vulnerable, which you can get around if you take possession of anyone you open up to and never let them leave. So whoever that is, they might have the mindset to insistently try to take possession of everything they can get their hands on, including workers. So, if they're the exact opposite of Bruno and want children working for them because of how dependent they are on adults, they might try to take those children's parents out of the picture to become a parental figure they'd never want to leave. Someone got Jojo and Dragona's father fired, someone got Paco's father arrested, and someone in construction needed to build the bunker Meryl couldn't have anyone knowing about. Meryl needed a Werner Ziegler. Plus, there's another way Breaking Bad is relevant to the themes of the Jojolands, which is chemistry. A divide early on between Jesse and Walt was that Jesse saw their cooking as art, the indescribable absurd, whereas Walter only saw it as chemistry, the mechanism behind how different materials end up turning into each other and having different properties. Walt's story was about someone miserable with his life as a family man because he had too much of an ego to accept help from others who he couldn't get to boss around under his control, since he wanted to feel like he was the one solving everything and the rest of the people in his life were trophies that wouldn't really share the credit. So when he found out he had a terminal illness, instead of accepting financial help from his former colleagues he left because he couldn't stand to work alongside, he decided to turn to crime, which let him make a lot of money and grow his name at the expense of the lives of a bunch of people around him and the general population, who he was now contributing to the addiction rates of. And to do this, Walter took advantage of an addicted former student of his, whose life was in a vulnerable state and who never stopped seeing him as an authority figure he'd call Mr. White, by using this former student to do a lot of his dirty work and grow his criminal empire. And then a lot of the problems happened throughout the series because he couldn't handle the idea of not keeping this former student working under him. So, while Walter had chemistry knowledge, his belief that their cooking was only chemistry came from his stubbornness and his desire to see things as tools he always had control over. His entire run as Heisenberg was a pointless and counterproductive effort to make money for his family that preyed on the rest of the world, and that also didn't prolong his life more than the money from his former colleagues could have, because it was more like a tantrum being thrown by someone who was stubborn and self-serving, and needed to have control over everything, whether or not they were seeing things reasonably. Art and chemistry are two ways humans can rationalize how they make materials, but they're not exclusive, and what's important is not losing sight of what you're accomplishing or what you're doing it for. At the start of the Jojolands, there's a divide between Jojo and Dragona, because Jojo sees the world as a bunch of invisible mechanisms he could take advantage of or free himself from as long as he's able to identify them, whereas Dragona sees the world as an absurd you should try to find peace within. At their cores, they have the same intentions, but it's easier for them to see things in different ways. So, while their limited ways of seeing the world tie into their flaws, Jojo would not be a version of Walter. He's more like a flipped version of Jesse, who starts out seeing the world as mechanisms, but similarly also started out doing crime. The main villain would be someone who sees the world as mechanisms, but insists on finding ways to control things they fundamentally can't. And in the recent chapters, we found out that Meryl's been trying to fight her aging. So, since mortality is the big thing you can't change in Jojo, and Jojo's set up to be different from the main villain in a way that means at some point he'll make a choice unlike Dio and embrace his humanity, it really seems like Meryl is meant to be a villain. So far, Meryl is like a collage of the various key characters who broke bad in the same way Walt did. She works at a school like Walter, she has a million jobs and sells goods with an underground bunker like Gus, and she sits in front of a corny wall display in an office like Saul. If she is the main villain, her main gimmick is set up to be that she tries to possess everything and won't let anything, even maybe light itself, escape her, as her presence and empire grow in size and while she hides it all in the shadows. Because theoretically, if most information only travels up to the speed of light, then if you manage to pull in even that and grab time itself, then nobody's life can ever escape your grasp. and with the right tools, you could even heal someone no matter how critical of a condition they're in. I'm not saying that's right, I'm saying that's the justification someone with that character trait could convince themselves of, and then use to make themselves seem like they're not a black and white villain to the audience, the same way Valentine and Pucci were able to. But this would mean that her stand is not the wall, which I don't think would be, because for a power, the wall would probably be more about separating people and recruiting them into a hierarchy, which is totally in line with what Meryl does, it just wouldn't represent all of her at her core. And Meryl wouldn't have the superposition stand because Haka ended up having it, in the form of the Green Goblin from the Spider-Man films. Also, his official name was revealed to be Haka, with an H in the front and the rest of the letters still from the Italian version of the letter H. So his name is still the letter H, but now it looks more like Harry Osborn's, which implies that this stand was inherited from his father similar to D4C, but because it's a stand power and not just the mantle of the Green Goblin, it was able to transfer the other personality, like D4C passing on Valentine's memories, which would make Haka more of a sympathetic Doppio and less of a main villain. So as our only strong candidate for the main villain, if Meryl's stand is less about the freedom side of superpositions and more about possession, then the wall could still be an ability she uses if it's something she's formed an unequal symbiotic relationship with, because there's a good chance the lightning-bending power of the Fulgurite, the lava rocks, and the coarse skin of Charming Man's village all come from a type of rock life form that's meant to latch onto things and form symbiotic relationships with them.